On a chill September morning in 1408, the bells of the stone church at Valsey in Greenland rang out across the fjord. The sky was crisp, and a veil of mist clung to the rolling hills as guests gathered for a joyful occasion, the wedding of Thorstein Olafsson and Sigrid Bjornsdottir. Dressed in fur-lined garments and accompanied by neighbors who had braved the wind-carved trails from scattered farmsteads, the wedding party glowed with life. Laughter echoed off the church walls, mixing with hymns and the lowing of distant cattle. But what no one realized, what no letter recorded, was that this celebration would be the last known human whisper from the Norse of Greenland. After this wedding, the Norse voices went silent forever. Why would an entire civilization vanish, not in fire or conquest, but quietly, leaving behind nothing but bones and stone? What secrets still linger in the ruins? If you're fascinated by history's untold stories and legendary empires, don't forget to subscribe and tap the bell, so you're the first to uncover what's hidden in the past. The Norse had thrived on Greenland for centuries. It began in 985 AD when Eric the Red, exiled from Iceland for murder, sought a new beginning. He found an icy wilderness, but through sheer charisma or cunning, he named it Greenland, suggesting lush pastures and a fresh start. His branding worked. Settlers came, and they brought sheep, goats, and dreams of a northern utopia. They built the eastern and western settlements along the milder fjords of the island's southern edge. By some accounts, over 20,500 people once called this frozen outpost home. But it was never easy. The settlers had to adapt European-style farming to a brutal, unfamiliar environment. The land offered little grain and few trees. Their lifeline was the sea. They hunted seals, fished, and carved out a life, sometimes quite literally, from ice. And yet they endured. For hundreds of years they endured. They built churches with imported stained glass. They minted marriages and hosted funerals. They explored far shores. Leif Erikson even sailed to North America from Greenland. So what turned endurance into extinction? Was it just the cold? Or did something more insidious seep in beneath the snow? Evidence shows that by 1300, things began to fray. The western settlement, more remote, harsher, was abandoned first, possibly by 1350. Nobody knows exactly why, but the signs point to hardship. In the eastern settlement, where the 1408 wedding was held, the population clung on longer. But even here, changes crept in. Archaeologists, digging through layers of trash, found fewer cattle bones and more seal remains over time. The Norse were giving up beef and milk for blubber and salt water. Chemical analysis of their bones shows that by the end, up to 80% of their diet came from the sea. Was this desperation or adaptation? Their world was changing, and not just culturally. Nature itself turned on them. Around 1250, the warm centuries that had made Greenland viable gave way to a cooler climate, now known as the Little Ice Age. The growing season shrank. Hay yields plummeted. More sea ice choked the fjords, making trade difficult and sailing dangerous. Greenland became less green by the year. Did the settlers recognize this shift? Did they hold emergency meetings in their great halls, surrounded by beams of imported wood that they could no longer replace? Or did the change creep so slowly that by the time it became lethal, they were already too few and too weak to act? Even as the land grew harsher, another blow fell. Trade, the colony's lifeblood, began to collapse. Greenland's economy had long relied on exports of walrus ivory. In Europe, this exotic material was in demand for everything from sword hilts to church altars. But in the 14th century, a new supply of ivory arrived: African elephant tusks. Cheaper, easier to procure, and more plentiful, it displaced Greenland's niche. The market dried up. Without ivory to trade, the Norse couldn't import iron, timber, or grain. They had only what they could scavenge, hunt, or grow. How do you survive when your currency is worthless and your home is drifting further into isolation? Compounding the crisis was the Black Death, which reached Norway in 1349 and devastated the country. Greenland's colonial overlord was suddenly crippled. With Norway's population halved, there were no spare ships to send to the Arctic fringe. Greenland became a dead end, a place no one wrote to and no one visited, a silent world. Even if the plague never physically reached Greenland, it shaped its doom. No more settlers arrived, no relief supplies came, and no message from Valsey was ever answered. Was the wedding couple of 1408 celebrating amidst unspoken fear? Did they know their colony was on the brink? Some letters survive from that time, noting the marriage and a few legal matters, but they end abruptly. Then, nothing. The stone churches still stand, but they hold only echoes. Roof beams collapsed, farmsteads buried by snow. No human remains in their final houses. The Norse didn't just die, they left, or vanished. Where did they go? The snow didn't kill them, not at first. The Norse of Greenland had lived with snow for centuries. What changed wasn't just the ice, but the silence that came with it. After the 1408 wedding, no ships came, no letters followed, and no travelers made it back to Iceland or Norway with news. The trail simply ended, and in that eerie silence, nature began to reclaim what human hands had built. One of the most persuasive explanations for this quiet collapse is climate. The onset of the Little Ice Age wasn't a sudden avalanche. It was a slow squeeze. Winters lengthened, summers shortened, grazing lands shriveled. The hay harvests, so crucial for overwintering livestock, diminished. Sediment samples from Greenland's southern fjords show prolonged droughts during the 1300s and 1400s. That's right, droughts in Greenland. The name had never felt more like a cruel joke. Imagine trying to survive in such a place. You've built your life around cattle and sheep, just like your ancestors. But now the land feeds neither beast nor man. You switch to seals, fish, and birds. You ration what little fodder remains. You patch your buildings with bones instead of timber. Bit by bit, the European dream of Greenland becomes untenable. And still, they tried. Trash heaps, nature's most honest historians, reveal attempts to adapt. Seal bones pile up, fish hooks evolve. People didn't surrender easily. But there's a limit to how much resilience a society can muster when every outside support has been severed. How long can adaptation delay the inevitable? Consider the economy again. Walrus ivory had been the jewel of the North. It bought nails, tools, and respect. But as African elephant ivory flooded the European market, Greenland's unique offering lost its value. The ivory they hunted with such difficulty now fetched far less. The last known shipments of ivory from Greenland occurred in the early 1400s. After that, no one was buying. With the ivory trade gone, so too went their last financial tether to Europe. Fewer ships meant fewer visitors, fewer supplies, and no new colonists. In isolation, the settlements became ghosts in waiting. Worse still, the Black Death gutted Europe's population and its economic networks. Norway, Greenland's parent nation, was so devastated it barely had the strength to defend its own shores, let alone supply a distant island. Historians debate whether the plague reached Greenland itself, but in a way, it didn't have to. Its effects were felt across the sea. The very idea of colonial management disappeared under the weight of death and political chaos. Imagine waiting for a ship that never arrives, year after year, until the waiting itself becomes your culture. But the Norse were not alone on Greenland. Sometime around the 1200s, Inuit peoples, the Thule culture, began migrating into Greenland from the north. They were skilled Arctic survivors, with technologies and traditions perfectly suited to the environment. They used kayaks, dog sleds, and snow goggles carved from bone. Where the Norse tried to recreate Norway, the Inuit harmonized with the Arctic. The two groups met, and the records, scant though they are, tell us they did not mix easily. Norse documents mention the Skraelings, a term used for indigenous peoples encountered during Viking explorations. Accounts hint at violence, including skirmishes and killings. Inuit artifacts appear at Norse sites and vice versa, suggesting some contact, some trade. But the archaeology tells a subtle story: coexistence without integration. They lived near each other, yet apart. So could conflict with the Inuit have contributed to the Norse collapse? Possibly, but probably not primarily. There is little hard evidence of sustained war, no mass graves, no battle-damaged buildings. It's more likely that tension existed, perhaps competition for resources, but it wasn't the nail in the coffin. Yet that doesn't mean the Inuit didn't have a role to play, perhaps not in conflict, but in survival. As the Norse dwindled, the Inuit endured. They adapted, thrived even, navigating the very climate shifts that wrecked Norse ambitions. The difference? Culture. The Inuit were not trying to transplant Europe to the Arctic. They lived within the environment's terms. They had whale harpoons and flexible housing. They moved with the seasons. They didn't need hay or timber from abroad. They didn't build stone churches. They didn't write letters that would never be read. What if the Norse had adopted Inuit methods? What if pride or belief in a fixed identity kept them from learning? And yet, some theories suggest they may have tried, at least near the end. There's a suggestion, faint and speculative, that a few Norse might have assimilated. But so far, DNA evidence doesn't show any crossover. If intermarriage or cultural blending occurred, it left few traces. Could the final Norse have chosen to walk away from their religion, language, and history just to survive? That's one haunting possibility. Another? That they died out one by one, cold and forgotten, in empty halls surrounded by seal bones. Some researchers have proposed that a small group attempted to flee. They may have set sail, back to Iceland perhaps, or toward North America. One old Icelandic saga mentions a returning Greenlander, though its accuracy is debated. More likely, any such escapees vanished without record, perishing at sea, or absorbed into other populations so fully they left no mark. And in the end, all that remains are ruins, stone churches, eroded foundations, and unburied bones. Great halls that once heard hymns now echo with wind. There are still people who argue about the exact cause of the Norse disappearance, whether it was more the climate or the trade, the famine or the isolation. But perhaps it's not one thing. Maybe it never is. The eastern wind whispers through the ruins of Hvalsey, rattling through the empty stone walls like a ghost tapping on long-forgotten doors. These are not ruins of conquest or catastrophe. They are the remains of lives slowly dimmed, like candlelight, lost to the creeping dark. By 1450, not a single Norse farmstead was known to be occupied in Greenland. No one wrote to them. No one came looking. The Norse Greenlanders didn't just vanish from the island, they vanished from history. How can the disappearance of an entire society go so unnoticed? The answer lies in the world's indifference and the settlers' remoteness. Greenland was always on the edge, not only of geography, but of Europe's consciousness. For centuries, their presence was tolerated, but not cherished. When they stopped sending ivory, they stopped mattering. Even so, their end didn't erase all curiosity. When Danish missionaries returned in 1721, nearly 3 centuries after the last Norse vanished, they were stunned. What they found were stone buildings buried in snow, old paths choked by brush, and nothing but bones in the soil. No descendants, no legends, just a silence as thick as the ice itself. Did the missionaries know they were walking in the footsteps of ghosts? They didn't come seeking history. Their goal was to convert the Inuit population and reintroduce Christianity to what they assumed were lost sheep. What they discovered instead was that someone had already moved on. The Inuit had their own traditions, their own gods. The ruins were curiosities to them, relics of those who were here before. Even the local stories had no real names, no clear cause of death. It's easy to romanticize these lost Norse as victims of nature, or perhaps of their own stubbornness. But their story is more nuanced. Archaeological digs reveal they tried. They adopted seal meat and fish-heavy diets. They even burned seaweed and dung as fuel when timber ran out. Yet, despite their adaptations, they kept clinging to a vision of themselves as European farmers. They continued building churches. They kept up social hierarchies. They maintained European customs long after the environment had stopped supporting them. At what point does cultural pride become self-sabotage? It's a question that haunts every archaeologist who has walked among the crumbling walls of Gardar or Brattahlid. Why didn't they change more radically? Why didn't they adopt Inuit tools, shelters, or techniques en masse? Some suggest it was sheer inertia. Others think religion played a role, an unwillingness to abandon Christian identity. Others still believe it was fear, pride, or simply a lack of opportunity to engage deeply with Inuit communities. But what if we've been asking the wrong question all along? What if the Norse didn't vanish? What if they were absorbed? A handful of scholars have proposed that some Norse may have quietly assimilated into Inuit society. Though current DNA studies have not confirmed this theory, absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. Cultural blending doesn't always leave neat footprints. A few Norse individuals might have married into Inuit families. They may have shed their wool cloaks for sealskin, swapped lamb for blubber, and taken new names never recorded in any European ledger. Would such a transformation be considered survival or erasure? There's one haunting tale that captures this idea. An Inuit legend tells of tall strangers who came from the south, lived briefly among them, then vanished again. The story is vague, but it speaks of difference, of brief coexistence, and then of disappearance. Could this be a faint echo of Greenland's last Norse? The question lingers. Who was the last Norse Greenlander? Was it a farmer alone in a stone hut, staring at the frozen sky? A woman who buried her last child and walked into the white? A priest saying the final mass at an empty altar? Or was it a youth who slipped into an Inuit kayak and paddled toward an unknown life? Historians still debate the balance of causes: climate, trade, disease, isolation, or cultural rigidity. Each factor seems insufficient alone, but together they form a grim mosaic. Unlike dramatic collapses of other civilizations, Greenland's Norse faded quietly. There were no fiery deaths, no mass graves, no climactic wars. Their end was a whimper carried by the Arctic wind. And yet, centuries later, we're still asking, where did they go? The mystery has inspired novels, documentaries, even theories of secret migrations to North America. Some believe a ship set sail westward, possibly to Newfoundland or Labrador. If so, no record of arrival survives. The sea, ever hungry, swallows more than ships. It consumes stories. In a poetic twist, the modern age has become obsessed with their fate. Climate researchers study Greenland's Norse to understand the consequences of environmental stress. Social scientists see it as a cautionary tale of cultural inflexibility. Artists depict the lost wedding at Valsey as a metaphor for human frailty. There are still people who argue that we haven't yet found the last settlement, that something remains beneath the ice. But perhaps the more important truth lies not in bones or ruins, but in what their story reveals about us. Would we have fared any better? In a time when climate once again looms as a threat, and when global networks show their fragility, the Greenland Norse become more than a curiosity. They become a mirror. They lived on the edge. They tried to hold on. And when the world forgot them, they quietly became part of the snow. As the last church bell of Greenland's forgotten Norse fades into history, the mystery remains unresolved, but not untouched. The people who settled the icy shores with sheep and dreams didn't leave behind a great battle or a last stand. Instead, their disappearance reads like a slow retreat from the edge of the known world, a long exhale under a frozen sky. They were determined, resourceful, and in many ways heroic. But they were also bound by traditions that could not bend far enough, fast enough. The stone churches they built now serve as silent witnesses to this tragedy, buildings meant for eternity, left to time. Their bones are few, their names forgotten, and their legacy uncertain. Yet, in their ruins we see reflections of our own moment, a world in flux, caught between tradition and survival, identity and adaptation. The Norse were once us, or perhaps we are becoming them. Let that be the soft echo we carry forward, not only a cautionary tale, but a reminder of the human will to endure, even as the wind turns colder and the lifelines fray. Maybe we won't know their exact ending. Maybe that's not the point. Their real legacy might not be in the mystery of how they disappeared, but in the questions they left behind. Would we adapt faster? Would we learn from our neighbors? Would we see the change coming, or wait, like they did, for a ship that never sails? In the end, the Norse of Greenland are still out there, not just in the frost-bitten soil, but in the stillness between survival and surrender, where every human story waits to be remembered.